Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. It's a Ukraine Frontline update for the 4th of October 2023. Before we go to the map and look at the front line, let's just get an idea of what's going on in the counteroffensive as a whole, as according to the Euromaidan press, who's released a pretty useful analysis, sort of valuation of how it's going. Ukraine's counteroffensive, signs of concern and optimism. Ukraine is creating the conditions for a decisive breakthrough on the ground and has the initiative at sea, but Russian airstrikes are a reason for growing concern as is the West's resolve to support Ukraine. I broadly agree with this analysis. It brings up many of the points we've been talking about here. So firstly, Russia has established supply lines to circumvent Western sanctions, enabling it to increase its domestic production of missiles. The number of missile strikes has simultaneously gone down. So it's saying that they think that it can produce more missiles, but it's not firing more missiles, which then would lead to the idea that it's stockpiling missiles for the winter. So as we can see here, exactly what I've been talking about, that there are fewer missiles being sent as a trend, but there is an increase in Shahed drones, which are these blue lines being sent. And that's why it says, secondly, domestic production. So domestic production, it is producing itself long-range strike drones combined with the increased delivery from Iran. So both of those components lead to a great increase in drone strikes across Ukraine, and that can be seen by these blue lines. So they are hammering Ukraine with drones that are causing issues, as we've seen in Izmail, Reni and Odessa particularly, but also other places like Dnipropetrovsk and Mykolaiv, so on and so forth. There are a number of places that are coming under quite a lot of attention. It goes on to say, during the last 3 months, Ukraine has knocked down any combat aircraft, so no fixed-wing aircraft, while only shooting down 8 helicopters. During the same period, the Russian Air Force has increased the number of airstrikes from 1,410 in June and then steadily upwards to 1,925 in September. This is something that we've noticed. I've been talking a lot in the last week or two about the use of glide bombs, guided glide bombs, FAV-500, that the Russians use, and these are becoming a growing concern for the Ukrainians. During the last 4 months, it continues, the Russian Air Force losses are greatly reduced, while the number of airstrikes has increased by 36.5%. So they are possibly using aircraft more cautiously, less offensively. So the attack helicopters that were beginning to get lost in fairly high numbers, although they were doing a lot of damage to Ukrainian armor, are possibly being brought back a little bit, but they've upped the use of these glide bombs released from Russian fixed-wing aircraft from a long way behind the lines. So it has greatly increased the launches of glide bombs against Ukrainian positions, cities and settlements. First employed in early March, the Russian winged UPAB 1500 and FAV 500 glide bombs are being used in increasing numbers. On the night of the 2nd of October, 40 of them were used against military and civilian targets in one oblast only. I mean, these are of greater greater explosive payload than a Shahed drone, right? These are big old bombs. So if you're having 40 of these, this is the equivalent of more than 40 Shahed drones, being sent and broadly successfully hitting their target. I mean, they're not greatly accurate, but they just do damage wherever they land, and wherever they land, they broadly explode. Apart from if there's a mistake, there are a few of these, particularly early doors that were falling into the ground and not exploding. I don't think that's from electronic warfare. That's from just being dud. So the growing Russian air threat is a matter of concern. Agreed. Okay, onto the land war. 4 months into the counteroffensive, Russia has been unable to stop Ukraine's slow but steady advance along the Bakhmut, Melitopol and Berdyansk axes. I think they've actually kind of ground it to a halt in the Melitopol and Berdyansk axes, actually. While the size of the liberated area might come across as unimpressive, the combined efforts are amazing. The land forces are advancing through some of the most densely mined areas ever, while facing impressive fortified positions protected by Russian artillery, MLRS, anti-tank systems, mechanized maneuver forces, attack helicopters and combat aircraft. I would broadly agree with that. It's coming at a great cost, I think, that they are advancing slowly but surely. But I think those advances have slowed down significantly over the last couple of weeks. We've seen nothing in Velika Novosilka particularly, and only marginal advances and even some pushback in the Robotina area. So the losses of personnel you can see there are trending downwards. Loss of Russian personnel, as according to the Ukrainian General Staff. Defending fortified positions, Russian personnel losses have fallen gradually since the offensive started 4 months ago. Russia is still losing on average an average of 17,500 soldiers a month. It lacks strategic reserves and is forced to laterally transfer units to reinforce hotspots along the front line. Agreed. As a consequence, reports of low morale are substantiated by recorded complaints of lack of rotation, high losses, lack of medical support, lack of artillery and armoured support during assault operations, lack of faulty ammunition, and more. Agree with all of that. Ukraine is little by little wearing down the Russian forces in occupied territories. Agree with that. It's taking out, so then goes on to talk about different pieces of equipment. So really heavy artillery degradation. Of course, you can call into question those stats, but taking them as true, or at least, proportionally true, so maybe they're 80% true, the same trend line would exist on the graph, irrespective of the actual numbers. So that is important. Main battle tanks being attrited, the army of drones being responsible for hitting an awful lot of stuff. So lots of details they go into here. Trucks being destroyed is going up and up. There was a little bit of a down tick, but the general trend is up. That was July, but so Ukraine is creating the preconditions for a decisive breakthrough. I would agree with that, but I think that they need to stop, and they probably are stopping, letting that kind of activity take place before they really push on properly. It's just too attritional to push on, as I've talked about several times over the past week. Russia's maritime power in the Black Sea is being reduced. The UK Defence Intelligence report stated that recently. Russia is increasingly more dependent upon its aging Su-24 Fencer and flanker combat aircraft. Again, that's a UK intelligence report from today saying that, to conduct maritime strike operations, as a Black Sea fleet's ability to project maritime power is slowly being reduced. And then that said, as previously stressed, Ukrainian progress comes at tremendous costs. So cities and settlements close to the front line are exposed to 20 to 25 airstrikes, 40 to 70 MLRS, and 80 to 150 artillery strikes daily. Some cities and settlements have ceased to exist altogether. Ukrainians are daily exposed to the threat to their lives and a fight for their right to exist. And it talks about the potential losses of Ukrainian personnel, casualties, civilian and armed forces. So, it comes at a high cost. Do these gains warrant those high costs? That's a question that it will be difficult to answer, but it's a good question to ask. I think this is a pretty good analysis. Go and check it out on the Euromaidan Press. Right. Okay. When we go to the front line, I'm not going to dip into the ISW just for time, because I spent a long time doing that. And I'm running a bit short, sorry. But no mapping changes. If you want to see what the lines on my maps mean, please check out the map legend, which is now on your screen. I forgot that, so pause the video, check that out. Anyway, the lines here, we have no change along the northeastern axis, although there is something to be said about whether the Russians are doing shaping activities to actually do a major push in this area. Andrew Perpetua said this, and in fact Borova has been hit 2 nights in a row. I think that's over here, which is directly to the west of AVdivka, which was this area that the Ukrainians have been pushed back. The Russians to the sort of west-southwest of Svatova have pushed the Ukrainians back there. Then they were sort of pushed back themselves by a Ukrainian counter press, but the objective appears to be Borova and the Oskil River. They would only be really concentrating on bombing Borova as opposed to anywhere else in particular if there were intentions of hitting there. They aren't just going to put a pin in the map randomly and go, we're going to hit there. They're hitting Borova fairly consistently over time, and they're not hitting some of these other places. Okay, they are generally hitting a number of places along the front line and back from the front line. But if they're going to particularly concentrate on Pidliman and Borova, then you can assume that they probably have intentions upon those places, which means that this is looking like shaping operations, which means that they might be readying themselves for a counter-attack in this area, or an offensive in this area, or they might not, but they're at least shaping towards that. Whether they make that final decision or not, as Andrew Perpetua says, is anyone's guess. Right, as we come further to the south, Syriac map's a pro-Russian map, and just to remind you, we're sorting out the polygons here. JR, who helps me with the mapping, when I say helps me, I mean predominantly does most of it. He's so amazing. He's devised a way where he can combine these. He's talking about it this afternoon. So you want to look at the outermost blue lines here. Sorry for the confusing other blue lines there. It will be less confusing within a week, so sorry about that. But anyway, some gains for the Russians as they're pushing forward here. This red line is just following an oblast line there. Unfortunately, you can't have one big polygon in Google Maps because you can only have 1,000 vertices on a polygon before it says no, I'm not doing it anymore. So you have to split areas up, and we've done that in oblasts where it can be done, but then we've had to split some of these more detailed areas or where things are changing into other polygons, and then it gets a bit confusing. But anyway, that's just to let you understand what's going on. Syriac maps shows some progress in Spirna, and the Russians are apparently inside the outskirts of Spirna. Russia has captured the first small part away from the center of Spirna in Donetsk Oblast. That's Global War Monitor, but we also have Syriac maps as well talking about that. It's not quite in the right place. Syriac maps here saying the situation in the Eastern Front as a result of positional battles. The Russian army has recovered some of the lost positions east of Spirna. So actually there has been a bit of backwards and forwards here, although it's been a gradual game for the Russians, because if you remember, there was this sort of refinery place that has underground tunnels and whatnot that the Ukrainians were hanging on to for quite a long time, and then that is now no longer in their hands. So there has been this gradual advance of the Russians towards Spirna. Anyway, as we come further to the south here into Bakhmut area, there are no particular claims, no sources for me to draw from, just some mapping changes. Andrew Perpetua, and he talked about this on his live stream last night. The Russians have been pushed back again just behind this railway line to the north of Klishchivka. There has been some backwards and forwards here. The Russians are so keen on not losing anything in the Bakhmut direction that they throw a lot into counter-attacking lost positions, both north and south, and that is apparently very attritional for the Russians. So the Russians are, according to some sources, losing significant casualties in this area. It's also painful for the Ukrainians. They are on the attack and they're trying to clear out really well established dugouts all along this railway line. It's not that it's plain sailing for the Ukrainians by any means, but the Russians in their counterattacks are apparently losing quite a few troops too. So the Ukrainians are trying to take positions along here. They're having some success in clearing out that railway embankments and the tree lines either side of it. Still ongoing, trying to push into Kurdyamivka from the north here. There has been, Andrew Perpetua saying that it seems that the Ukrainians go on the attack for a couple of days. Russia, then they kind of stop, regroup, and the Russians attack back for a few days, and it kind of goes on like that. And after these kind of attacks, counterattacks, the lines just gradually seem to be moving. They might go backwards and forwards a little bit, but there is a gradual trend to them moving eastwards. That's how I would see that. But yeah, attacks to the north of Kurdyamivka and around Andriivka, north and south of there. Okay, and then we come on down. There's a few Russian gains, according to Andrew Perpetua, just around the railway line here. That's coming into Mayorska. Don't really know too many details of that, other than it looks like a bit of a tree line has been taken, part of the tree line there. So I'll have to look into the details of that. But yeah, a small game for the Russians in that area. As we come down to AVdivka, in fact, let's go and have a little general chat about the AVdivka area. This is Geraman, who's a very pro-Russian source who often spreads some pretty wild stuff, and denies Russia ever losing anything. The Russian aerospace forces are currently preparing the industrial sector of Avdivka for offensive operations by the Russian armed forces. This area is literally being razed to the ground. FAB 1,500, so those are really big bombs. It's not the 500s, those are 3 times bigger. They are 1,500 kilograms of explosives, have landed there several times today. So we've seen the coke mine, or the coke, I don't know, processing plant be hit in this way. The industrial area is being hammered. It is very likely that Russian forces will storm this area in the coming hours. So he's saying imminently that there will be a big attack in the industrial area to the north of Avdivka here, and that the Russians are not just whacking this with huge bombs for no reason at all. So again, that goes back to, if they are hitting places with bombs repeatedly, there's probably some method to their madness, right? So that is potentially worrying for the Ukrainians. Will it happen? I mean, we've heard about rumors about up in the northeastern sector, and now here it could well be the case, though. Okay, so now we're going to go south of Avdivka. Let's go on my map just to talk about where we're going. So first of all, Andrew Perpetua has some small gains for the Ukrainians along this tree line here, pushing the Russians back there. Direct Maps has it more charitable for the Russians around the area, but it seems that the Ukrainians have been having some limited success around Opitny and even towards Vodyany, this kind of area particularly. They have pushed the Russians back, but yeah, that's good news for the Ukrainians there. And even better news in the Novelsky area. Now, Andrew Perpetua talked about how he knew this some days ago. He was very conservative with his mapping and just waiting for a video. Video has come out and he changed it, and now other people seem to be catching up. So Syriac Maps here showing that the Ukrainians have made some gains. In the last few days, they've retaken a series of positions northeast of Novelska after positional battles. This is very useful because, as I said many times before, Novelska, despite being a very small kind of agricultural community, is an incredibly important and well-defended area. This whole area is just littered with trench lines and dugouts in the tree lines, and it's very difficult for the Russians to take it without losing substantial casualties. And for the Ukrainians to push back here, that gives them an extra sort of buffer zone as they're pushing on towards Pisky. So I think that's good news for the Ukrainians in that area. And then we come down to, well, this tree line in Krasnohorivka, where you've got, as according to Andrew Perpetua, just this mine area under the Russian control. Syriac Maps, as you can see, has it a bit more charitable for the Russians there, controlling all of this area. Andrew Perpetua doesn't have them controlling, probably for the reason that he has seen an awful lot of footage to suggest that, well, basically the Russians have been trying to take this tree line going like that, the 3 sides of a rectangle there. The Russians have been trying to take that and some positions further up here, and they've lost a phenomenal amount of armor. Not phenomenal, which is a large number of pieces of equipment. And personnel, one would assume as well. With that, he was saying that they even had, I think, RT as well, Russia Today, or film units filming this, thinking this is going to be a big one, sending units up, and unfortunately it wasn't. It was like a bit of a disaster for the Russians. So good news for the Ukrainians in this area. If you're up for getting, feeling good about the good news, this is an area of good news for the Ukrainians, where there are 2 areas that the Russians have been pushing at, and they have taken significant losses. The same can be said about Uruzhany, which I've mentioned previously. We mentioned this in live stream the other night with Andrew Perpetua, but just to say, he's detailed that in his live stream last night. Lots of detail about these tree lines. So yeah, that's been challenging for the Russians there. And then there's been some activity, as we've seen over the last week, around here, the tree line there that's been squeezed for the Russians. And these over the last few weeks, these settlements have been hammered by I don't know whether it's missiles or FAB 500s or both, but certainly there's a lot of attention on these settlements going back for the Russians there. We come around the corner down to the southern Donetsk area, and we come to Yeah, so Priyutne and Donetsk. So Donetsk here on the way to the Velika Novosilka salient, which has been pretty quiet, especially for the Ukrainians in terms of attacking there. Global War Monitor says a clarification on the front lines near Uruzhany and Novodonetsk. New Russian positions have been added after being shelled by the Ukrainians. So that's to say that just here, it appears that wherever that is exactly, it's quite difficult to tell, but probably here. That's to say that in line with Syriac maps, the shelling around here suggests that Novodonetsk, this area, is more firmly under Russian control. I think that's how I'd interpret that, but actually maybe not. It could be somewhere else because that's not the settlement of. Oh, there. Okay, that's Zavitya Bazania. Sorry about this. I should have had that. That's in this area. Then so it's not Novodonetsk. It's between the two. So areas around here that the Russians could be in control of more than was previously understood. Now, forget these second blue lines. Remember, we'll be getting rid of that. That's a royal we, because I'm fairly ignorant on these things. And then we have Priyutne, which is just to the west of Staromyorsk in Uruzhany, where the Ukrainians seem to have been pushed back. Syriac maps here says that the situation southwest of Donetsk, Russian army is continuing advancing north of Priyutne and has reached the Grushevaya Canyon for the first time since August. So they were pushed back there when the Ukrainians were doing fairly well. If you remember, they had mined this canyon. It was very difficult for the Ukrainians to attack directly across there, so they had to come in behind here and behind here, and they had some success chipping away at the Russian ground there. But now Russian territory. Sorry, now the Russians are pushing back in the Priyutne area, which is a little bit of a concern for the Ukrainians. But it seems to have gone quiet as far as Ukrainian attacks are concerned. Just to remind you that the Russians had a massive attack, Symphony and all that, around here, around Uruzhany, where they sent in total 15 vehicles that Andrew Perpetua counted that were lost. And interestingly, and I said this morning, I think it's an important observation, the Ukrainians claimed there were 15 vehicles lost, and Andrew Perpetua saw evidence for 15 vehicles at least being lost. So that is an exact confirmation of what the Ukrainian General Staff or the Ukrainian forces are claiming. So when we're talking about who's believable, who's credible, who are making claims that are justifiable, the Ukrainians, at least on a number of times, are making claims that are credible and evidenced. Not so much the Russians. And for music aficionados, I made a faux pas in saying massive attacks, unfinished symphony. It's unfinished sympathy, isn't it? And it was the verbs kind of reworking of that, which is unfinished symphony. Anyway, whatever, Pierce. Let's move on to further to the west. We're coming to Robotina, and as you can see, there are no real changes, just a tiny increase according to Syriac maps. So I don't know if I've got that marked anywhere. I think it might be just a really small one that is not represented in a tweet or anything. Just literally that. It's just that tiny area there has been added to the Russian territories, according to them, but no other mappers show any gains there. There are various claims coming out here, claims of some Ukrainian success in the area, but they're all in generalities. You have Wargonzo here saying that Novoprokopivka, the Russians have retreated to a more advantageous position. Well, at least, sorry, P-Star 1-1 is saying that. The claim here is in Zaporizhia direction, Ukrainian troops with massive artillery support are attacking Novoprokopivka. The Russian armed forces were forced to level the front line on the northern approaches to the settlement. In other words, that they're leveling the front line means that they are moving back to have a straight line. So, for example, it might look like that. I'm not saying it is, but that would be leveling the front line, and they'd lose that whole triangle. Where that is, I'm not wholly sure, but maybe the Russians are under some pressure in to the north of Novoprokopivka. Tatarigami has a little analysis of the trenches and why everything's so difficult. Leading up to and during the counteroffensive, many independent observers underestimated the preparedness of Russian defences. Seemingly unremarkable tree lines concealed well-prepared Russian positions, fortified and complemented by extensive minefields. In Section 1, which displays satellite imagery of the tree line near Robotyne on July the 13th, it is evident that while there are some noticeable changes near the tree line, such as earthworks, the majority of positions remain concealed and not clearly visible. In Section 2, the August imagery positions are the August imagery exposes the presence of Russian positions after tree destruction. Many observers primarily focused on visible defensive lines, often missing concealed positions. This led to a misconception of vast empty spaces between the fortifications. In the final third section, depicting the situation on September the 11th, we can finally discern a system of trenches and concealed individual positions along the tree line. So this is as the trees get destroyed, the earthworks that are actually in place are more and more visible in satellite imagery, and so you can see, oh my goodness, right, the Russians really have done a lot of digging and fortifying. So let's take another look, he says, and run the brief comparative analysis. In this case, independent observers may focus on the visible trench, ignoring concealed positions. However, the absence of foliage reveals the defensive positions clearly, so it's quite difficult to see in this right hand picture when you've got a lot of foliage before the summer has had it done its thing, and before artillery has done its thing. You wouldn't necessarily think there's much to worry about. This is just a tree line, but actually there are fortifications within that tree line that the trees are disguising. So overall, these positions are typically detectable by drones, particularly when occupied by enemy forces. Yet there have been cases where they've eluded detection, where only partially revealed or mistakenly presumed unmanned, catching approaching Ukrainian forces off guard. As events progressed, it became clear that these seemingly empty areas were fortified and ready for defense. The remaining spaces were heavily mined and closely watched by drones, which allowed artillery and loitering munition to attack approaching troops. This can also partly explain the lack of a swift advance for Ukrainian forces after Ukrainian forces breached the visible defensive line with anti-tank trench and Dragon's Teeth. Ukrainian troops must still face enemy positions in many tree lines along with FPVs, first-person view drones, artillery, mines, and helicopters. So this is going to be a problem for the rest of the war, for the rest of whatever Ukraine do. These things are everywhere, and as the Russians retreat, if they can do a slow, controlled withdrawal, which you can argue, this has been like a slow control withdrawal back to these defensive lines, then they can spend all of that time, as they are, I'm sure, day by day, doing exactly the same in every single one of these tree lines. And then as they pull back to there, they just do it further back. So the whole process is insanely attritional. Or if it's not attritional, it's very time consuming, and they don't have the artillery ammunition. You want to just obliterate these with a load of bombs dropped by aviation, but you can't do that. So you have to do it with artillery. You don't have the artillery ammunition, and everything becomes really, really slow. Continuing offensive progress hinges on artillery ammo available. Oh, here he goes. Ammo availability for advancing troops, as it's vital to suppress numerous enemy defenses and force their withdrawal. Additionally, the readiness of reserves to advance and take positions remains crucial. The comprehensive analysis can be found on my project's website, Front Intelligence Insight, listed in my bio. So he does that. If you want to go and check out the work he does elsewhere, you can do so. So I think that's a really useful analysis. It just gives you some indication of every one of these yellow lines is a particularly difficult fortification to overcome, but it's not just that, and perhaps even more so, it's these hidden ones that catch you off guard, and the ones that aren't hidden, that are just there. You just know every single tree line will contain Russian positions and dugouts and fortifications. It is tough. Anyway, there you go. Not a massive array of sources, and because there's not a massive array of information coming out at the moment, just a few odd changes here and there. But as you can see, this is, to me, this is again evidence that goes towards that I think the Ukrainians are sort of grinding to a halt, and we'll probably need to rely on distance attrition until spring, unless they throw something major at one of these sort of areas where you thought they might be making a breakthrough and it sort of stopped. I think we're still going to be able to fight in this area right the way through winter. There are some claims coming out that nothing's going to stop. Winter will not be a downtime for any of the troops, and you might see continued offensive, but it might look very different than a very big full scale push. As you might have expected. So anyway, let me know what you guys think. Hopefully that was informative and useful for you. Please take care. Toodle pips, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.